So I think the hedge funds principles, one has to go back to the basics about why we adopted these principles. They were about systemic risk because we were recovering from a financial crisis. We are still recovering from that. And these principles were talking about mandatory registration of hedge funds and about their disclosure. And that disclosure was for systemic purposes. As time has passed, we have seen regulatory regimes kick in terms of Dodd-Frank in the US and in terms of what we're talking about for the AIFMD in Europe as well as in other jurisdictions. So the registration aspect of that, the fact of bringing them within the ambit of regulation, because they were earlier treated as unregulated entities, they have come in the ambit of regulation. And with time, we are getting disclosure, we're getting information from them. IOSCO is conducting hedge fund surveys, and we've conducted the second survey this year, which we have published. And that is already telling us that there are developments happening in the hedge fund space in terms of not only their regulation, but in terms of the transparency of information so that we can know what their footprint is, what, if any, systemic risk they pose. And that will help us to deal with what policy measures are needed to deal with them. So in short, I think there has been quite a lot of ground covered. And the hedge fund principles have met at least some of their objectives in terms of transparency and disclosure and in terms of being able to assess the extent of systemic risk that can be posed by hedge funds. Yeah, so there are two levels at which this question can be answered, and I try to do that when I say that at one level what you are really looking for is global regulatory institutions, and that is institutions that establish a level playing field, that have fair rules of process in terms of how regulations are established, and also which have mechanisms to settle disputes and so on. Now that is something that is quite a way off. It's not going to happen tomorrow or next year. So the next best to that is to have global standard setting happening, because global standard setting at least replicates some of the positive aspects of what I was saying. So it has a global standard setting behavior or global standard setting process is inclusive, is fair, takes into account the voices of different jurisdictions and not necessarily just the biggest ones. And it has a due process in terms of consultation mechanisms. So and there has been, in practice, we have seen a few good examples. I would say, following the LIBOR scandal, you had the work that happened on benchmarks, for instance. So the IOSCO principles that were established on benchmarks became the global standard. And that happened before any national or most national or regional regulations came into place. On OTC derivatives, you've got the principles for the governance of financial market infrastructures. And they came, so about CCPs, trade repositories, and so on. And they came about with global joined-up effort. It was the same jurisdictions that have the CCPs and so on that have participated in that. You got on the OTC derivatives the aspect about margining of non-clear derivatives, and that also happened ahead in time to a lot of what other jurisdictions did. So there has been some bit of progress in terms of the world seeking to be joined up in terms of developing the standards and then taking cue from that in developing the national regulations. It's not happened in all cases, but it is starting to happen in a few cases, and that makes us take heart.